Everyone, I'm Dr. Keith Mathis with the Mathis Group. Let me thank you so much for watching our monthly videos. This month we're dealing with vendor management, and we also are going to be providing some information next month and even the next month after that on vendor management, how to monitor, how to be able to look at some of the contracts. Hopefully that will be something that will be helpful with you and for you. The vendor management, as we look at this, we're looking at a project or a portion of the project being run by someone outside the organization, such as a vendor. And that's very important for us to be able to manage those individuals and hold them accountable to the contract. Now, the course content we're looking at today is we're going to talk about developing some tools for working with vendors. We're going to talk about vendor motivation and techniques for making it a win-win relationship, because that's what we really need. And we want to look at ways to select and monitor and control vendors, as well as how to work with internal procurement in order to get the vendor we need. So we're going to deal with this over the next couple of months in order for you to have all the content. We also are going to talk a little bit about how to make vendors a partner or an extension of the stakeholders rather than just a worker bee who's coming in to do something. We're going to look at examining all sides of the vendor management, such as developing vendor management plans, identifying performance measurements, discussing various contract types. All of those are going to be part of this, but it's going to take us 2 or 3 months to get it all in here. Let's start off with an overview of vendor management. What is vendor management? Vendor management is a selection, examination, and control of all outside suppliers. It can be short-term or possess long-term contracts, depending on the objective of the organization or of the buyer. Now, as you're looking at vendor management, and if you run numerous projects throughout the year, it's not uncommon for you to have many different type of vendors that are working for you. Some might be long-term vendors. We have a 7-year contract with the state of Kansas. And so when that goes away, we bid on another 7-year contract with them. So we're a long-term vendor for them. However, there are many organizations we will come into and we will be with them every 2 or 3 years. So in that case, we come in and provide a product or a service, in our case a service, and then we go and we will come back later to help them in something else. Here are the different types of vendors, and sometimes we don't think about it like this. We can have contract workers, which is becoming very common today because organizations are not really wanting to have a long-term commitment to certain type of job specifications. Well, but a contract worker, the risk with a contract worker is there's no loyalty, because many times they're looking for a better contract, or they can be switched over. If they're working for a large vendor, they could be switched over to another organization, and there's no long-term commitments. You can also have an outside vendor, which could leave for other customers. Expertise when you need it, that's the benefit, but the downside of that is that sometimes the person you want is not the person you're going to get. They could have gone someplace else. Many people have part-time workers which have limited availability. That's your biggest risk of working with them. And the benefit, though, is that flexible hours, no long-term commitment, because once again, organizations are trying not to make a long-term commitment for an individual unless they have to. And then the last would be low-cost vendor. The risk is the staff turnover. Anytime you hire a low-cost vendor, and many organizations, that's what they look at, is what is the cheapest person or the cheapest company I can go with. You're going to have low cost. In that low-cost environment, you're going to have a lot of staff turnover because they're paying their workers less. So what happens is they're constantly going to that next highest level to be able to make more money. The good benefit is it's limited cost. But if you like the vendor or the person representing the vendor, a lot of times you don't have access to that person continuously. Vendor and value added. A vendor will give greater value to their preferred customers to go beyond cost and performance to build a strong relationship. Value added can be focused on giving the customer what they need in the manner they desire it. Now, when we talk about value added, they talk about here in this slide, as we talk about preferred customers, we're talking about that ability to go that extra mile with that customer. Your preferred customers are going to get that. Why? Because they're constantly giving money to that vendor, and that vendor sees that long-term commitment, and that's who they're going to give the preferred service to. Even in our case, we have people who have worked with us for 25 years. Those are preferred customers. We're going to have a tendency they're going to get first pecking order of dates and certain types of people they want, compared to the person who just calls and says, I want this one day, and will you come in and do it? Here's an overview of vendor management graphically. Maybe this will help you a little bit. When you're talking about vendor management, you also are talking about creating RFPs, and that's a request for proposal. And so when you look at that process, you're looking at creating an RFP, and that RFP is going to generate, you're going to have to generate sources of who's going to get that RFP. You're going to have to generate a selection of which vendor is actually going to win the contract. And then you've got management of that contract after the vendor has been signed. Now, the challenge that you have in vendor management a lot of times is the project team might or might not be involved in the source selection and might or might not be involved in selecting the actual vendor themselves. But many times the actual project team is overseeing the contract management of that vendor who won the contract. And then, of course, you've got services and products that they're going to deliver that you're making sure is going to align with your contract and with your specifications. The buyer and vendor perspective is a little different. From the buyer's perspective, you're trying to maximize profits, avoid needless risk, limit non-scope work, increase customer commitment, and long-term agreements. From the vendor side, you're trying to minimize costs because you're under contract with that customer. You're trying to hold the vendors accountable. You're also trying to guarantee satisfactory results, and you're trying to maximize vendor commitment because what you're wanting is for both sides to be connected and be together. It's very important for the buyer and vendors to be on the same page, and this has to be a great working relationship. This cannot be a fight over everything. Here's some challenges of vendors. Many vendors are attempting to understand the internal workings and culture of the organization in a short period of time, and this can be challenging because many organizations, and yours might be included, has multiple cultures within that organization. Even different floors can have different cultures, and different departments can have different types of culture. Also, they're trying to produce solutions which will work without any internal control, and motivating people who do not supervise and getting them to give information and work with you. Now, the second point here I want to talk about just a moment, trying to produce solutions which will work without any internal control. The vendor is an invited guest under contract, but you could be working with many of the stakeholders to give you additional information, to be able to verify that what the vendor is doing is what the customer wants. This is very important, and many times the customer is very lackadaisical about this. So this is a huge challenge. Also, motivating people who you do not supervise and getting them to give information and work with you. Since you have no position power and you're an invited guest, what happens is trying to get these people to be committed to come to a meeting, to talk with you, to return your call. All of these can be huge, huge challenges with a vendor. Let's look at the relationship environment. You've got the deal. The deal is going to be the contract. And so you've got a lot of things on this. You've got external forces. You've got the buyer. You've got the business environment. You've got the vendor. And all of us are trying to come up with the deal to be able to satisfy the problem from the customer standpoint and be able to give new business to the vendor. And between the buyer and the vendor, we're both working in a business environment that can be very challenging because of the different cultures. Let's look at the buyer challenges now. How did bad vendors become part of our selection process? When we're training, we do training all over the country, we find and hear people talk about bad vendors, and absolutely rightly so. Many of these vendors are horrible, and you wonder, how did these vendors become part of the process? And in many cases, they're part of the process for a long period of time. Second question, how can we keep bad vendors from hurting our goals and our plans? Sometimes you do have a bad vendor who's trying to play the contract terms and not really trying to fulfill the contract. They're just trying to get paid and as long as they possibly can. And of course, you're trying to get rid of bad vendors and not have them hurt you. And how much damage will this bad vendor inflict on us? I've seen bad vendors, even though I'm a vendor, I've seen bad vendors working with organizations that I'm thinking, how in the world did you ever get through the contracting process to be able to have this type of contract? And the vendor is missing out, because if the vendor understood that if they do a good job with the customer, that customer will call them back for years, that's where most of your business comes from, is having a great relationship. The relationship pendulum. You're trying to balance both price and competition as well as relationship and trust. And the vendor has to earn that trust. That trust is not automatically given to the vendor. The vendor has to earn it by what they communicate. They have to earn it by being able to be on the same page with the customer, to keeping them informed. When a vendor is not communicating to the customer comes up with their own conclusions. So the vendor has to be willing to communicate, even if it's bad news. For an example, if something goes wrong in a project, that vendor ought to be making contact with their representative from the customer base and let them have a heads up on what's going on. They don't have to tell them blow by blow, but they can say, hey, this is happening. It looks like if we can't fix it, it's going to be about 7 days longer on the project. I think we're going to fix it. Our folks are working on it very hard. I'll call you back and let you know what's going on, but I want to give you a heads up in case anything came up. That customer representative appreciates that, and that's part of building that trust that we're talking about. Looking through the eyes of the vendor. Many times the customer is looking only at their side, or the vendor's looking only at their side, but it would be great if we could look through the eyes of each other. In looking through the eyes of the vendor, compare purchaser and vendor motivation. The purchaser, which is the customer, is to get a great deal, to create a long-term relationship, to pick a vendor which produces high quality. And obviously the purchaser is trying to do it for the cheapest price possible. Of course they are. We all would try to do that. On the vendor side, they're trying to be profitable. They're trying to create a long-term relationship, and they're trying to minimize waste that's going to cost them money. As these two groups come together with the vendor and the purchaser, it becomes a much more wholesome relationship. But as long as the vendor is only looking at it through the vendor's eyes and the purchaser is only looking at it through the purchaser's eyes, you're going to see conflict and you're going to see competition rather than complementing each other. And complementing is what's needed in order for that relationship to be awesome. Techniques on setting vendor expectations. Expectations can include a variety of items such as policies and procedures, practices and processes. For an example, mandating that the vendor follow the organization's internal best practices for running the project or conducting business. Now, some of our organizations out here have written and developed their own best practices. Some will follow PMBOK, some will follow Agile, and some will follow their own internal processes, and they have them documented, and they have flowcharts for it, and so forth. Okay, so you hire a vendor, and the vendor decides they're going to do their own thing. The vendor can do their own thing. If they're doing 100% of the project and they're not having to interact with any of the stakeholders, the vendor can follow their own processes. But if the vendor is doing part of a project within the culture on site with you, they need to understand the processes or the best practices of the customer, because all the rest of the team is probably following those best practices. The vendor must comply with the best practices of the customer if they're on site, if they're working with the team in that manner. Now, if the vendor's doing a 100% turnkey deal and they're out here doing the project and all they're doing is coming back and handing it off, of course, the vendor has their own best practices for doing things. But when you're talking about that they're doing part of it on site, or they're doing all of it on site, and they're working with team members that represent the customer, and I'm not talking about contract management team members, I'm talking about worker bees, then they're going to have to understand those best practices. Mandating that those best practices be followed is part of connecting that vendor and bringing them into the culture. The vendor expectations can be set verbally and then reinforced both in writing and contract specifications. Now, you're setting those expectations. This does not have to be a hard-nosed kind of thing, or you don't have to be a jerk about this. You can just say, here's what we're expecting, because what you're wanting to do as a customer, you want to start laying the foundation to build a good relationship with that vendor. What you want to do as a vendor is do the same thing. And so when they're telling me verbally what they want, I'm looking through my contract. I'm making sure that I understand the contract as I signed it, and they're making sure they understand the contract as they delivered it. And these expectations are going to be huge to reducing that. Setting the right tone with the right roles and the right responsibilities. Right tone, right responsibilities, right roles is imperative in every type of project. We need to know as a vendor who to go to. We need to know as a customer who we should be talking with. It starts with vendor orientation. It's important in immediately building the connection on how the vendor-customer relationship should function. It allows you to give all expectations beyond what is designated in the contract. Now, when we talk about vendor orientation, a lot of things can be talked about here, such as how often we're going to communicate. One of the things I like for us to talk about is, if I put a phone call into you, will you guarantee that to the best of your ability, you will call me back just as soon as possible? And we guarantee the exact same thing for you. By doing this, this allows the vendor to understand and the customer that you're a high priority with me. And I'm going to do everything I possibly can to keep that communication flowing. So you're not going to put a phone call into me and it take 4 or 5 days for me to get back with you. Now, I might send you an email and say, hey, I'm traveling throughout the day. I'll get to the hotel tonight and I'll call you tomorrow morning. But you've still made contact. That's still communication. But this needs to be a higher priority. Many vendors are floundering, and we could have offset that if we were the customer by giving them their own orientation. The orientation also allows both parties to meet key individuals, allowing the relationship to function with high communication. It can include anything which might be needed to reduce ambiguity in the relationship. This is Sally. Sally's going to be working with you on payment. This is Tom. He's going to be doing spot checks and audits with your project. And so all of that allows you to be able to understand who the personnel are that's going to be working with you on the various areas of a project. It means a huge amount to the vendor. And as a customer, this needs to be part of just the normal foundation you deliver to that vendor. Challenging issues with your vendor. A lot of areas can become challenging. If we don't do a vendor orientation, these things will come up. Let's start with the first and the most common, communication or lack of communication. In projects and with your vendor, to set it up to where you talk with them, do a conference call or a video chat weekly or bi-weekly is very important. Every Thursday at 2 o'clock, you do a video chat with your vendor. And that does not take away from you talking with them throughout the week. Core competencies. These are the core competencies or the people skills that we need, or the type of skills we need for this project. Many times you'll see a vendor go low-cost provider. They've sent resumes in on all their highest qualified people to get the contract, but then they send second-tier people in. These are good people. No mistake what I'm saying. They're good people, but they don't have the skills that the first-tier people did. You'll also have people skills and interpersonal relationships. We've sent people in to do work sometimes and they don't know how to build the relationship. They're kind of tough to get along with. They're kind of crusty personality. All of those things tear down the relationship building that we have. And then monitoring and supervisory issues. Who's monitoring the people and who should we be talking to if we don't like how they're performing? The project scope, we always have to have trouble sometimes on the project scope, what the customer wants and demands, what we understand in the contract, and blending that together. The time, the cost is all parts of that as well. And then payment. How is payment delivered? Is it based on deliverables? Is it based on time? Is it based on milestones or the completion of phases? All of these are pieces that have to be talked about, because all of these can make a huge difference in the success of the vendor and the cash flow of the vendor, and also the happiness of the customer that the vendor is delivering everything they say they will. Working in a dual project manager environment. Many people don't deal with this, but I think this is huge. When you're working in a dual project management environment, you have to go the extra mile in communication. Here's how it works. A dual project manager environment could be, I've got a project manager on the vendor side who's running their part of the project, and then we've got a project manager on the customer side who's overseeing the pieces of the project the vendor's not under contract to deliver. When using a vendor, it's common to have an internal project manager and a vendor project manager. Internal project managers might feel they have little or no control and may not have any actual team members. Now, this scenario sets up quite often. You'll see this in government, especially when you hire a vendor to do most of the project, if not all the project. You'll have an internal project manager who's working for, let's say, the government or the state of Kansas, and yet the other project manager works for the contractor, and all the contract personnel work for that person. So an internal project manager for the state of Kansas might feel they have little or no control over the vendor contractor and contract workers because they report to the vendor. And of course, that's absolutely true. However, if the internal project manager is having a problem, they can talk normally to the vendor personnel. But remember, those personnel really report to the vendor project manager. And so that's who we really normally need to be talking with most of the time. Now, all of this could have been worked out in a vendor orientation and everybody could be on the same page. Both project managers need to understand that there may be confidential information one cannot see about the other. For an example, on the vendor side, the state of Kansas project manager cannot look necessarily at the actual costs of the vendor side and how much profit they're making. The actual vendor might not be able to look at internal confidential information the state of Kansas has. So there has to be that understanding that there's confidential information possibly on both sides. Both project managers must remember they're dealing with people, and their counterpart must be considered in decisions and communication as possible. So rather than just making your decisions in a vacuum, you're wanting to include this other project manager and give them FYIs for your information. Here's what's happening. Here's what's going on. And that's going to happen through, obviously, text, emails, conference calls, video chats. You want to make sure both parties are in the loop. Even something as simple as, I'm going to be gone a few days to a funeral. I just want you to know that next Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday, I'm going to be gone to a funeral. I'm not going to be able to have our conference call. That's fine, but we need to let people know. Don't just disappear and the other party does not know what's going on. Internal project managers have to understand that, and they need to be very specific on what they need and give deadlines. Internal project managers must realize there might be confidential processes on the vendor side, information or data which is forbidden for them to see. Now, sometimes on the customer side, we feel like we've got confidential information, but we think the vendor should not. The vendor's got proprietary information as well. So we need to be very, very careful with that. The vendor's going to be protected for some of that information. External project managers have to understand certain things as well. Vendor project managers must remember that the buyer wants as much control and information as possible. They must be kept informed and updated on all progress, audits, and concerns as often as possible, and open communication builds a strong relationship. Now, as we look at the vendor project manager and the customer project manager, it's imperative for you to understand this. Obviously, the vendor project managers want and the buyers want as much control as possible. Both sides want control of this situation, and both sides have to be kept informed about progress, audits, and concerns. We can't spring this stuff on people and not expect for them to react. And open communication builds a strong relationship. So, I mean, as we communicate and we have that open communication, it's going to be beneficial for both of us to make sure that we're communicating with each other. We're letting each other know about what's going on. Nothing happens that we're not communicating back and forth. And the trust will skyrocket in those situations. So it's a benefit for both the vendor and the customer to do everything they can to build the relationship and to communicate. If you want a win-win situation, that's where it's going to be. Now, let me close with this section today. Let me thank you so much for watching our project management video series, and I hope it's been beneficial to you. I hope this is something that you're able to apply. You do have the rights to be able to download this video and show it to your staff, and show it to anyone you'd like to be able to help educate them and put some of these core competencies into their life. Thank you so much. If I can help you, please contact me. Have a great day. Bye now.